as with every Friday sermon, we start by sending peace and blessings upon the Prophet when we say, Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. In our relationship with God, we're constantly striving to figure out and discover new ways in which we can be grateful to Him. And one of the things that I like to think about that we can be thankful to God for is this ability for us to recollect and relive past experiences through the power that He's given to us of memory. And granted, there are parts of our past that we choose to forget or that we want to go over and not recollect anymore. But I thank God for giving my mind a certain capacity to look into the past and remember the parts of my life where I struggled and then was able to endure and overcome that difficulty. The parts of my past I can recollect in conversations with loved ones that have now shaped me into the person who I am. The parts of my past that I can recollect decades ago of my experience as a child, and those memories now still eliciting laughter and joy years later. It is in the same way that God has the Prophet ﷺ looking into his past in Surah Al-Duha when he asks him to remember the way in which we brought you from poverty and got you into wealth. The way we brought you from a state of being an orphan to now being brought into a family. The way we brought you from a state of disarray and now brought you into guidance. In the same way the Prophet discovers who God is through his past, I thank God for granting me the ability of memory to look into my own experiences to better understand who He is.
Hello.
And so I thank God for this ability. Alhamdulillah, it's the blessed day of Jummah, and Allah, who is Al-Jami', who is the gatherer, has gathered us here together again to be in a state of remembrance of Him. Imam Khalid and much of the team of the Islamic Center and a bunch of our students and community members, they had went on Umrah this past week and are actually flying out of Mecca, inshallah, tonight. And so I had the opportunity to be here today to, inshallah, give the khutbah. Today is the 28th of Jummah Al-Thani. It is essentially almost about 2 months before the start of Ramadan. We're almost starting the month of Rajab. So inshallah, that's going to be exciting. And may Allah grant us the ability to experience Ramadan again this year. So, just to kind of jump into it, I was kind of teetering as to whether I wanted to talk about this topic, but it's been long overdue, at least for myself, and I feel like if at any moment the time would be appropriate to bring it now. I'm sure a lot of you all know this month is Women's History Month, and not to say that this conversation is supposed to be limited to this month, but rather this is an opportunity for a good starting point. So I wanted to highlight 3 different stories that essentially talk about women and how women were dealing with environments and with attitudes that basically represented male privilege, that represented a patriarchal society. And I want to highlight these examples to just understand for us in our role as Muslims, and specifically in our role as men, what it means not only for our religion and this understanding of the system of patriarchy and it being broken down, but how we're being granted male privilege on a daily that we're not recognizing. So the first story I want to talk about is regarding Salama radiallahu anha. She was one of the wives of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and she was actually one of the earliest reverts to the religion of Islam. She was amongst the first group of companions. There were 16 of them, and she was amongst one of the 4 women of that group who migrated to Abyssinia because of the persecution they're experiencing in Mecca. So faith ran deep with her. She was basically there from the beginning. And later on in her life, she gets married to the Prophet ﷺ. She becomes a huge scholar, teaches other Sahaba and other folks who come after the Prophet in regards to Islam and the teachings of the most beloved ﷺ. So she is well aware of the faith. She knows what's up. And so one day she asks the Prophet ﷺ, she says, Ya Rasulullah, how come we as women are not mentioned in the Quran the same way that the men are mentioned in the Quran? And this question, whether or not we may have heard of it, right, there's like a go-to response of the way the Arabic language is written when you're referring to he, the huwa, or hum. Those male pronouns can also denote, referring to a larger group of both men and women. But my thinking is that if Salama, who's well-versed in knowing the Arabic language, it's not that she wasn't aware of that. But if she had that same kind of feeling, it feels like the Quran's addressing one group of people, not the other. There are plenty of other people who must have felt that way, and especially plenty of other men who must have felt that they were being addressed directly. So she asks this question to the Prophet ﷺ, and she says that the Prophet hears her question, and he thinks about it and he remains silent. Doesn't give a response immediately. And so the conversation continues, it ends up going into other topics, but she says, I did not receive a response to my question until later on when he goes to the minbar, to the pulpit. So she says, later on, right, I was in my room, I was combing my hair, and I began hearing the Prophet ﷺ talk from the minbar. So I quickly tied my hair, and then I went close to the door to listen as to what he was saying. The houses of the wives of the prophets were adjacent to the masjid, so they were right next to where the minbar and where the Prophet would gather and where they would pray. We could have all the brothers just move up, kind of condense the space. So the Prophet now, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is at this minbar, and he says, as directly said in the Quran, straight from the words of God, إِنَّ الْمُسْلِمِينَ وَالْمُسْلِمَاتِ وَالْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ وَالْقَانِتِينَ وَالْقَانِتَاتِ. God basically going down and listing, indeed the Muslim men and Muslim women, the believing men and believing women, the obedient men and obedient women. And he keeps going, وَالصَّادِقِينَ وَالصَّادِقَاتِ وَالصَّابِرِينَ وَالصَّابِرَاتِ وَالْخَاشِعِينَ وَالْخَاشِعَاتِ وَالْمُتَصَدِّقِينَ وَالْمُتَصَدِّقَاتِ وَالصَّائِمِينَ وَالصَّائِمَاتِ وَالْحَافِظِينَ فُرُوجَهُمْ وَالْحَافِظَاتِ وَالذَّاكِرِينَ اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا وَالذَّاكِرَاتِ أَعَدَّ اللَّهُ لَهُمْ مَغْفِرَةً وَأَجْرًا عَظِيمًا. He goes on, the patient men and the patient women, the humble men and humble women, the charitable men and charitable women, the fasting men and fasting women, the men who guard their private parts and the women who do so, and the men who remember Allah often and the women who do so, for them Allah has prepared forgiveness and a great reward. God breaks down into specific categories all the ways in which people could be recognized. There are fasting people, but not just fasting people, there are fasting men and fasting women. And the scholars say that for God to put this verse down is to essentially say that in any sort of capacity, what the women are doing in their deeds and their acts and their service to God, they are valued in the same way as they are the acts and deeds performed by men. But it's one thing to say that as a categorical statement versus breaking down. If you're truthful, it's the same way as if a man was truthful. If you're both fasting, it's seen in the same way. If you're both choosing to follow the faith, it's seen in the same way. And it says something about the fact that the Prophet didn't respond directly to her in the moment, but God had it so he would go to the minbar and then address the entire community so that it was known. That not only this verse was revealed, but that there was a question tied to it from a woman who was his wife, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who raised this concern. And it makes me think about back then, same ideas coming up as to what does it mean for not only the Quran to say things a certain way, but then the society around it to then accept it in a way that might be misconstruing what God wants it to be meant. And I remember when I was first learning this verse, when I was memorizing the Quran, it's a fun verse to recite because there's like a lot of rhythms and patterns, but I had no idea what it meant. And to kind of then reflect and think back that the reason why it's so long, and I'm trying to hold my breath in reciting it, is because God's trying to be as exhaustive as possible. That if there were to be a book, and that book were to be the book that I put down, this verse has to be in there. The second example I want to highlight is a story with Asma al-Ansariya radiallahu anha. So she comes up to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and she says, Ya Rasulullah, I was basically chosen as the woman from amongst a group of women to come to you and ask this question. Right? And so clearly, multiple people have this kind of concern, whatever this topic they want to address. So she goes to the Prophet and she says, I wanted to ask you this question. So she says, Ya Rasulullah, Allah sent you to the men and to the women. And we believed in you and your God. But we see that Allah has given some preference to the men. The men get to gather at the masjid, they get to congregate and pray. Right? The understanding that it's the men who end up taking most of the space at the masjid. And the Prophet ﷺ would emphasize the idea of there being a reward of 27 times moreover than if you were to pray at your home, to pray at the masjid. And so the women were not nearly as encouraged as much as the men. So she says that they get to congregate and pray in the masjid. They get to do hajj after hajj. At the time, the women were recommended to do the fard, the compulsory hajj that is obligatory upon everyone. But the men had access to do it over and over again. She says, and they have access to being able to die as a martyr, to go and fight in the way of God against those who are oppressing them. Ways in which back then it was predominantly the men who would go out and fight. So she's being real right here. She's saying, the men get to do this, right? They're doing that. And I know that God, in the message you bring forth, it's addressed to both men and women. So the Prophet ﷺ, upon hearing this, he turns to his companions, and it says he turns fully with his full face, and he says to them, he says, have you heard a better question than the question asked by this woman? And you talk about patriarchal attitudes, the Sahaba, the companions respond, and they say, we didn't think the women could come up with things like this. And so the Prophet ﷺ then turns back to the woman, to Asma. And he says to her, he says, listen, give salams to the group of people, to the women that you came from. Because the Prophet's well aware this isn't a concern that she has, but that a group of people, multiple individuals are thinking these things. And he says to them, he says to Asma, understand this. Just being a good companion equals all that you see men do. And the Prophet ﷺ in this moment is ensuring and making clear that there are ways in which things appear, and rightfully so, where people in the community, women see things one way, where it does not seem equally the same way as it is for the men. The Prophet's trying to make clear that as much as the gender roles might be different, the ability for you to value and put value into your life and be a servant of God is something that God will acknowledge, whether or not the way in which the men practice seem to be something that is at the same level. One thing to just think about in these first two questions that were brought forward to the Prophet is that the Prophet did not turn away Salama. The Prophet did not turn away Asma. It wasn't this understanding, right, that how could you question the wisdom of God, that these were the roles and things that men do, these are the things that women do, how dare you bring up something like that? It is that honest conversation and the women being real, being like, this doesn't feel right. And the Prophet ﷺ owning up to that, knowing that the way in which the patriarchal society, the Islam that was brought into that society, there's a lot of things that still need to be fixed. And this brings me to the last story I want to highlight, the third story. There was a lady by the name of Khawla bin Tha'laba, radiallahu anha. And Khawla, she said that she had a husband by the name of Aus ibn as-Samit. So they were in a marriage, and he was much older than her. And so she's telling this story, as it is recollected in the narration, and she says that Aus used to be a very abusive husband. Verbally abusive, emotionally abusive. And she says that one day, we got into this huge argument. And basically at the time, right, there were ways in which the men in pre-Islamic days, they were able to say something and that would basically constitute divorce, right? They just had that kind of power. And a lot of that kind of bled into when these people became Muslim, right, to kind of unwrap and basically unseed those previous beliefs. So they get into this argument, and he says this phrase that's said in Arabic, and he translates it into English, it essentially means, you are to me like my mother's back. He says that to her. Essentially meaning that you are to me like my mother. You're haram for me, you're forbidden. I'm not going to engage with you. You don't have the rights of a wife anymore. I'm not going to touch you. Basically, I'm going to have you as prisoner in this house, but we're not married anymore. So Khawla sees that. She's like, okay, right? It happens. She knows he's been abusive. The very next day, he goes out and then he comes back. And Khawla says he comes back and his mood is obviously different. He's not as angered in the same way that it was the previous day. And he begins to try to get intimate with Khawla. So Khawla was like, hold up. Right? You just declared divorce on me the day before. Don't act like you're trying to get, with this like the very next day, acting like whatever happened before didn't happen. And she says that he tried to then physically force himself upon her, but she said that fortunately I was physically stronger than he was and I was able to push him away. And then she goes to the Prophet ﷺ. And she explains the entire story to the Prophet. Got an emotionally abusive husband, this verbally abusive husband. This is what happened. And right then and there, by the grace of God, there was an entire surah, Surah Al-Mujadala, the pleading woman, that gets revealed and sent down to the Prophet ﷺ for Khawla radiallahu anha. In this surah, it starts out, قَدْ سَمِعَ اللَّهُ قَوْلَ الَّتِي تُجَادِلُكَ فِي زَوْجِهَا وَتَشْتَكِي إِلَى اللَّهِ. Allah says, Allah has heard the plea of that woman that has come to you, O Messenger, complaining about her husband, and she grieves to Allah. And Allah hears your dialogue. Indeed, Allah is hearing and seeing. God reveals an entire chapter of the Quran, not just for you and I, but for the entirety of humanity from the time that the Prophet received that revelation to the end of the universe, for us to engage and read. It is a story about an abusive relationship, but not only that, the continuous presence of God in these moments of despair. I think to myself that the rate in which we hear about domestic abuse, domestic violence, and the rate at which we hear a lot of victims, predominantly women, go through these tragedies, what is a story like this doing in the Quran for both us as men and women to read about? One of the things to understand is that God is making clear that He's constantly hearing the concerns, the complaints, the stresses of His servants. And at the same time, for people who might be in situations where they're in a domestically abusive relationship, and they can't complain, they don't have a Prophet ﷺ to go to, they are not in a position to voice this to someone to gain help, God is saying, I'm still listening. I'm still listening. And this is so important. Because of all the women and of all the stories that God could have highlighted for us to see and recognize, He chooses a case of domestic abuse because He knows that whether you're a woman or a man, and more so whether you're a man, you got to be aware of that. You got to be aware of that. And there's plenty of us who know women, people in our lives who are going through domestic abuse. But a Prophet ﷺ, the Lord of the universe, He's not ignorant of these things. It's in the Quran. And so I highlight these three stories as a way to then segue to what does it mean for us today, and for us specifically as men, and understanding what does it mean for us to have male privilege, but to also operate in a society that is still largely patriarchal. بارك الله لنا ولكم في القرآن العظيم ونفعنا وإياكم بما فيه من الآيات والذكر الحكيم أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So I wanted to bring up this topic to one, highlight aspects of our deen, of our tradition, in which these types of conversations have happened once before. But then I also wanted to talk about it today in the context of where we are, and the fact that often, many of us, especially us as men, we are benefiting from male privilege in ways that we're continuously ignorant of or oblivious to. And I know many of us are aware of it, right? I'm just being real. Whether it's in society as a whole or within our Muslim spaces, that kind of privilege and patriarchy still exists. One of the things I often think about, as someone who's blessed to often lead the prayers and lead the congregation, is that for me as a man, it's much easier to have a kind of platform or access to a platform in which I may lead a single prayer or do something and then get immense amounts of recognition or acknowledgement for it. In the same way that there might be someone just as righteous, just as knowledgeable, and even more so, right, who isn't a man, but those kinds of platforms and just in general the setup of the way we function as a community, there's certain times where the same platforms aren't offered. And a huge learning point that occurred for me was an incident that happened 2 years ago. It really had me kind of shift as to what I saw as to the ways in which platforms I had access to were actually ones that were not universally accessible for both men and women. So 2 years, about 2.5 years ago, around November 2015, as I'm sure many remember, there was a huge attack that happened in Paris. And so at the time, Facebook was putting out those filters where you can change your profile picture to the flag of France. And there's a lot of basically media attention around that. But at the same time, you also had just a few or a couple months ago an incident in Kenya where we had over 100 students that were slaughtered. A couple days before the Paris incident, you had 2 suicide bombs that went off in Lebanon that killed over 40 people. And you had other incidents that were taking place in Iraq and in Syria. But it's clear that the shift and what the media was choosing to focus on wasn't fair. So in the midst of all that, and things that were taking place here in the U.S. across different universities where racial discrimination, especially against African Americans, was again reaching a high point, our university here held this community forum. And so a friend of mine, she goes by the name, her name is Sana, I should say. A friend of mine, Sana, she actually was someone who spoke at this community forum that was hosted by the university. And she delivers this very passionate speech, eloquently delivered, about several topics, just basically tying up the kind of discrepancy, inadequacy, the disparity in how certain events were being given attention and certain weren't, and also just the general tension and again the pressure that was falling upon Muslims. The fact that we had people grieving for Paris and not for other places. The fact that America was putting out statements like Paris is an attack against all of humanity, that how do you feel about that when other places are experiencing similar strife and similar struggle? The fact that she is someone who visibly looks Muslim and wears a hijab was now feeling even more concerned about the idea that am I now more of a threat to people around me? That she was getting concerns of family that, maybe she should take off her scarf or do something different so she doesn't appear visibly Muslim. So she says all of this, an incredibly passionate speech. You can Google her name and you can find the speech. And the speech essentially goes viral, right? It goes crazy. Because to hear someone like that be so eloquent and basically identifying everything that was wrong with the situation and how people were hurting, from people overseas to our black brothers and sisters in America, it was powerful for people to see that. She then goes on to win the most influential award. You get selected to be one of 10 NYU's 10 most influential students. She received recognition from the Islamic Center, rightfully so, and she basically just got a lot of attention. Now I'm being completely real here, because it's the point of this conversation. As much as I was proud of her, and she said a lot of things that resonated with people deeply, part of me is like, that could have been me. I feel like I could have said those things. Right? Like I knew what she was talking about, I had an idea, and that was going in my head. Right? And the accolades kind of start building, you start feeling like, if someone was much more capable than you are, you're like, of course, like that's what they do. But when you feel like you could have done something and someone else was able to do it, mashallah, you can't help but sometimes feel that envy or that jealousy. And so I remember kind of like struggling with it and dealing with this. And so given, fortunately, the type of friendship that we have, at one point I sat her down and I told her about this. Right? I was like, I'm proud of you and I'm grateful, and a lot of people are grateful for what you've said, but there's also just this thing within me about this this kind of envy or this jealousy, right? Of like, I feel like I could have been doing that too. And this was probably one of the biggest learning points for me, where she sits me down and she tells me, she's like, one of the things you have to understand as a male is that the kind of platforms you are given to, and even just the access to those platforms, is not nearly in any way in the same type of realm of obstacles and struggles or challenges that women have to get to those same platforms. She's like, you've been blessed and you're honored to give the Friday sermon in the khutbah. She's like, that's something that frankly I can just never do. She's like, you gotta recognize that as a man in a society, not just within your Muslim community, but on a whole, your voice will naturally be one that will be put on a pedestal in ways that for a woman voice or a female voice to get to that same level is so much harder. And for me, this was such a reality check, because I can say clearly how oblivious I was to that understanding of what kind of privilege and opportunity I had as a man until I was actually checked by someone who wasn't a man. And this kind of all just ties back into this larger conversation about the system that we work in, the kinds of cultures that we come from, in which notions of patriarchy, notions of male privilege continues to get reinforced. And if we're not using our platforms specifically as men to recognize that we're being given certain opportunities that other people aren't, especially to our sisters, then we're just going to lose the consciousness of half of our ummah. And that becomes something that not only hurts the people around you, what does it say about the condition of your soul? And so I ask Allah that through the examples that we've heard, through the experiences we still experience today, and through the systems we're still working in, that we're granted that wisdom and knowledge of the kinds of privilege that we've been given. And that we're uplifting the people around us, whether it's because of a difference in gender and race, ethnicity. This extrapolates to all sorts of categories, that we're uplifting those same people that aren't being given the same platforms. So just a couple quick announcements before we go into dua. So there was one dua request from Sister Amira Shuman, who is the Assistant Director of the Islamic Center here. She said that her Aunt Yusra had surgery yesterday for breast cancer, and she's currently waiting on her stage and treatment plan. So we pray that Allah grants her ease through this process, and then inshallah it isn't anything serious in regards to the reports that she's going to be given. Alright, I think that's it. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. Indeed, Allah and His angels send blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad. So, O you who believe, send blessings upon him and greet him with respect. We say, Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala sayyidina wa nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Allahumma anta salam wa minka salam tabarakta ya dhal jalali wa ikram. اللهم أعنا على ذكرك وشكرك وحسن عبادتك يا مقلب القلوب ثبت قلوبنا على دينك اللهم إنا نسألك حبك وحب من يحبك وحب عملنا يقربنا إلى حبك يا أرحم الراحمين. Ya Allah, you are the source of love, the source of peace. You are the forbearing one, you are the most forgiving, you are the entirely merciful and the especially merciful. Ya Allah, we thank you for gathering us here today to be in the state of remembrance of you, to be reminded of our purpose, of why we were created, of why we exist in this universe. And Ya Allah, we thank you for allowing us to remember the people of the past, the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ya Allah, we ask that you forgive us for the sins we've committed, both knowingly and unknowingly, openly and secretly, the sins that we've committed with and without knowledge. And we ask that you grant us a wisdom to understand and recognize the weaknesses and the faults within us so that we can remedy them before it's too late. Ya Allah, we ask that in this day and age, in the systems that we operate, where we experience notions of patriarchy, and where we experience firsthand, for those of us who are men, male privilege, we ask that you just allow us to be cognizant of these types of systems. Ya Allah, that you grant our hearts a recognition that not everyone is granted the same opportunity or access to platforms, and that you allow us to utilize what we've been blessed with to uplift those who are still feeling oppression. Ya Allah, we ask that through examples set forth by Salama, radiallahu anha, Asma, radiallahu anha, through Khawla, radiallahu anha, that the stories and the questions that they ask that then allow for this conversation to take place, Ya Allah, we ask that we can benefit from these pious predecessors of the past. Ya Allah, elevate our souls as an ummah through us having a recognition that we are together one ummah, both men and women, and that we are not separate. Ya Allah, allow us to uplift one another with the understanding that at the end of the day, when our deeds are taken into account, it does not matter what gender we're coming from, but what our true intention was as to how we sought to serve you and your creation. Ya Allah, we ask that you elevate ourselves, our loved ones, and our family members, and that you grant us only the best in this life and the best in the next. And Ya Allah, for those who are experiencing trial and difficulty in this world, those who are in abusive relationships experiencing domestic violence, Ya Allah, we ask that you grant them ease in their trials and tribulations. Ya Allah, let their struggles be the means by which their souls are purified, and that they are granted that much more of a closeness to you. Ya Allah, let our presence in this world only be the means by which those of faith and those in humanity are granted ease, contentment, and greater closeness to you. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب اللهم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا مصطفى محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين وأقم الصلاة.